Thomas Gray sat at his desk, his eyes glued to the screen in front of him. The numbers flickered and dropped like the final breath of a dying star. His business, built over a decade, was collapsing in real time. His heart raced, his hands trembled as he dialed his assistant's number. "This can't be happening," he whispered under his breath. For years he'd lived and breathed this company. He had trusted every decision he made, believing in the system, in the people around him. Now all that trust felt like a lie. The phone rang. He could almost hear his assistant's frantic voice on the other end. "Thomas, it's bad," she said. "The entire market is tanking, and your investments, they're gone." The words hit him like a freight train. His entire financial empire, built on meticulous strategy and endless sleepless nights, was unraveling before his eyes. Panic set in. The life he had worked so hard for seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He leaned back, taking a deep breath. "I can't lose it all," he thought. But as the seconds ticked by, he knew the game had changed, and he was powerless to stop it. Richard Coulson leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the stormy sky through the rain-streaked windows. "This isn't just a bad month, Thomas," he said, his voice low and heavy with experience. "This is the beginning of something far worse. You've been played, and now the game's over." Thomas's heart skipped. He had trusted Richard, once a mentor, now a broken man just like him. But Richard's words were hard to ignore. "The market doesn't care about your hard work. It doesn't care about your dreams," Richard continued, his eyes narrowing as if he had seen this story unfold 1,000 times before. "It's always been about who's willing to do whatever it takes to survive." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, frustration building. "So what now? Do we fight? Do we fold?" Richard chuckled bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension. "Fighting means breaking some rules, Thomas. And sometimes survival comes at a cost." Thomas felt the weight of those words sink in. "What would you do?" he asked. Richard's gaze turned steely. "Do what you have to, son. No one else is going to save you." The days following Richard's warning were a blur. Thomas worked tirelessly, trying to salvage what was left of his empire. But every decision seemed to lead to more losses. The market was unforgiving, and his funds were dwindling faster than he could manage. Just as he began to lose hope, an unexpected call came in. It was Sarah, his assistant. "I think I found something," she said. "A loophole, maybe a way to turn this around." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't given up yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before all of this caught up with him. "Meet me at the office in an hour," he replied, already formulating his next steps. Maybe this was his chance to make a comeback. As the week wore on, Thomas's hope started to fade. The loophole Sarah had found wasn't as promising as they'd hoped. In fact, it seemed to be leading them down a darker path. The deals were complicated, and the financial risks were high. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him. Was he truly willing to sacrifice everything, including his morals, just to survive? The thought gnawed at him, but he knew time was running out. "I need to make this work," he muttered to himself, clenching his jaw. It was a dangerous game, but what other choice did he have? The next morning, Thomas sat in his office, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was being manipulated by forces beyond his control. He needed to confront Richard again. The man had been right about everything so far, but something told Thomas that Richard wasn't offering the full truth. "I've got to face him," he said, standing up abruptly. The betrayal was creeping closer, and Thomas was determined to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant facing his darkest fears. Thomas sat at his desk, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. His phone buzzed incessantly, each call a reminder of how quickly his empire was crumbling. The financial reports in front of him were filled with red, each line a symbol of the losses he had yet to face. Richard's voice echoed in his head. Survival means breaking some rules. The words haunted him as he stared at the screen, the numbers dancing in front of his eyes. He could feel the walls closing in, but there was no way out. His business partner, Henry, had been too quiet lately. It was as if he was hiding something. A part of Thomas didn't want to confront Henry, but another part knew he had to. Trust had been a luxury he could no longer afford. The phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. "Thomas, we need to talk," said Henry, his voice cold, distant. Thomas's gut churned. He knew this wasn't going to end well. "Where?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The office, now," Henry replied. The clock was ticking, and the confrontation would be inevitable. The meeting with Henry was uncomfortable, to say the least. Thomas had always trusted his business partner, but something felt off. They sat across from each other in the conference room, the silence between them thick and heavy. Henry shifted in his seat, his eyes avoiding Thomas's gaze. "I've been doing some thinking," Henry began, his voice lower than usual. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. "What kind of thinking?" he asked, trying to hide the anxiety in his tone. Henry let out a sigh. "I think we need to cut some people loose. We can't afford the luxury of loyalty anymore." Thomas froze. Cutting people loose? This wasn't the man he had known for years. "You're talking about firing employees?" Thomas asked, disbelief in his voice. "No, I'm talking about cutting ties with the dead weight. Anyone who's holding us back," Henry replied, his tone firm. The idea made Thomas uneasy, but deep down, he knew that Henry's vision might be the only way to survive. "And what about the investors?" Thomas asked. Henry's gaze finally met his. "We'll deal with them later," he said, his smile cold. Thomas's stomach turned. This wasn't the partnership he had signed up for. As Thomas left the meeting, his mind raced with questions. Was Henry right? Was it time to sacrifice some of their employees for the sake of survival? He had always prided himself on his integrity, but the financial world was different now. The market had no room for weakness. Walking back to his office, Thomas ran into Sarah in the hallway. "What's going on?" she asked, noticing the tension in his face. "Henry wants to cut ties with some of the staff. I don't know if I can go through with it," he confessed. Sarah's face softened. "I know this is hard, Thomas, but sometimes you have to make decisions that don't sit well with you." Thomas stopped in his tracks, staring at her. "You really think that's the only way?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "I think you have no choice," she said quietly. Thomas looked down, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had to make the right choice. But what was the right choice in a world where trust was a rare commodity? Later that day, Thomas found himself standing in front of his office window, staring out at the city below. The sun had set, and the streets were alive with lights, but inside, the office felt cold and lifeless. His phone buzzed again, and he reluctantly answered. It was Henry. "I've already started making calls," Henry said, his voice confident, almost too confident. "We'll have the layoffs done by tomorrow." Thomas's blood ran cold. "You didn't discuss this with me first," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're partners, Henry. You can't just make decisions like that." Henry was silent for a moment. "You want to survive, don't you? You'll thank me later," he said before hanging up. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. He had trusted Henry, but now he was questioning everything. Could he stand by while Henry tore their business apart, or was it time to make his own move? The lines between loyalty and survival had never been so blurred. The next morning, Thomas was in his office early, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, but the weight of the decision about the layoffs lingered. He picked up the phone, dialing Sarah's number. She answered on the first ring. "I can't do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go through with it, Sarah." Henry's crossed a line. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "You're going to have to make a choice, Thomas. It's either him or the company." The words hit him hard. He had never imagined a time when it would come to this, choosing between the people he trusted and the survival of the business. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I never thought it would come to this." Sarah's voice was calm but firm. "You'll figure it out, but don't let fear drive your decision. You've got to trust yourself." Thomas took a deep breath, his mind swirling with possibilities. It was time to make the hardest decision of his life. The following weeks were a blur for Thomas. The company was still reeling from the cuts, and the stress was taking a toll on him. He spent sleepless nights in the office, trying to salvage what was left, but every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The market remained unforgiving, and even though they had made strategic moves to stay afloat, the pressure kept building. Sarah had been working overtime alongside him, but even her optimism was starting to fade. One morning, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with another warning. It was a message from his lawyer. "The investors are pushing harder for control. They'll want to call in their debts soon." Thomas read the message over and over, feeling the walls closing in. His financial resources were stretched thin. His empire was slipping further away. As the weight of his failures crushed him, Thomas knew one thing: time was running out. The question was, could he make a last-ditch move to regain control, or was the end already inevitable? Sarah entered Thomas's office, her face lined with fatigue, but there was a new sense of urgency in her steps. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said, shutting the door behind her. He looked up at her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "The investors, they're planning to push us out. I've started looking at alternative buyers. We could lose everything." Thomas felt his heart race. The sinking feeling in his chest deepened. He had always known that the investors were a ticking time bomb, but hearing the reality hit him hard. "We need to make a move now," Sarah continued. "There's a window of opportunity, but it's closing fast. If we don't act, we'll have no control left." Thomas stood up and paced around the room. He had already risked so much, but now it seemed like it was all slipping away. "What kind of move are we talking about?" he asked, his voice filled with both desperation and hope. Sarah's eyes locked with his. "We could leverage our remaining assets to buy back shares and block the buyout," she suggested. "It's risky, but it might be the only way." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." The next few days were filled with frantic phone calls, meetings with their lawyers, and countless discussions about how to execute their plan. Thomas and Sarah worked tirelessly, crunching numbers and drafting proposals. It was a delicate dance. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. During one of their late-night meetings, as they looked over the final draft of their counteroffer, Sarah hesitated. "Thomas, are we doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with both uncertainty and resolve. "We have no choice, Sarah. If we don't fight for this now, we won't have a future," he replied, trying to steady his voice. Sarah looked down at the papers, her hand trembling slightly. "I know, but it feels like we're just digging a deeper hole," she said, her words heavy with the weight of their decisions. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the proposal. "Sometimes the only way to survive is to take the risks others won't. This is our chance." With that, they sent the proposal to the investors, hoping it would be enough to turn the tide. The next morning, the response from the investors came in. The deal was rejected, and the tone of the response was chilling. They had seen through their plan and were not backing down. Thomas sat in stunned silence as he read through the letter. It was over. Their last-ditch effort had failed. His mind raced as the room seemed to close in on him. His hands trembled as he set the letter down, his head pounding with frustration and fear. Sarah stood behind him, her face pale. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Thomas didn't answer at first. He couldn't. The weight of the failure was almost too much to bear. The investors were no longer willing to negotiate. Thomas felt like he had lost the only card he had left to play. As the silence stretched between them, he knew he had to come up with a new plan. But the truth was, he didn't know if he had it in him anymore. They had risked everything, and now it seemed like it was all falling apart. Days passed, and the weight of the rejection continued to hang over Thomas. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. He had one last meeting scheduled with Henry, but it was clear that their partnership was strained. When Henry walked into the office, Thomas could feel the tension in the air. "We need to talk," Thomas said, his voice firm. Henry crossed the room, taking a seat across from him without saying a word. Thomas looked at him, the anger and frustration finally surfacing. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" he asked. Henry's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes in silence. "I did what I had to do," Henry replied coldly. "Now it's your turn." Thomas clenched his fists, the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. Henry had always been about the numbers, the survival of the business. But Thomas had always believed in people, in loyalty. That belief was slipping away, and now, there was no turning back. After the meeting with Henry, Thomas could feel the walls closing in. The tension between them had never been greater. It was clear now that their paths were diverging. Henry had taken the hard-nosed, cutthroat approach, while Thomas still clung to the idea of loyalty and integrity. But the stakes had changed. There was no room for idealism anymore. As the days wore on, Thomas found himself pacing his office late at night, staring out at the city below. He could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sarah. "Thomas, I've found something," she said, her voice urgent. "It might just be the break we need." Thomas's heart raced. "What is it?" he asked, his tone filled with anticipation. Sarah's voice grew quieter. "There's a hidden asset, something we missed, a piece of real estate tied up in an old deal. If we can access it, it could give us the leverage we need to fight back." Thomas stared at the phone, his mind racing. This could be their chance. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We have to act fast," he said, a new sense of determination in his voice. The next morning, Thomas met Sarah at the office early. She had the documents ready, the ones detailing the hidden real estate asset that might give them the leverage they needed. As they sat down to go over the details, Thomas could feel the tension mounting. Every move they made now was a risk. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," Sarah said, flipping through the papers. "But it's also dangerous. If the investors find out we're trying to leverage this, they'll move even faster." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. "We don't have a choice," he said quietly. "We fight now or we lose everything." Sarah hesitated for a moment. "I'll reach out to the lawyers and get the ball rolling. But we need to act fast, Thomas. This could be our last chance." Thomas felt a rush of urgency. "Let's do it. No more waiting." With that, they moved forward, knowing that every decision from here on out would have massive consequences. It was all or nothing. As the lawyers worked to unlock the asset, Thomas found himself reflecting on everything he had sacrificed. His thoughts were interrupted when Henry called. The conversation was brief but loaded with meaning. "I know what you're trying to do," Henry said, his voice tinged with something like amusement. "You're playing a dangerous game, Thomas. You'll regret it." Thomas held the phone tightly, his jaw clenched. "I'm doing what I have to do, Henry. I'll regret nothing." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Henry spoke again, his tone colder. "You're fighting a losing battle. You're playing with fire, and you'll get burned." Thomas didn't respond. The call ended with Henry's words still hanging in the air. As the phone clicked off, Thomas's hands tightened around it. He had no illusions about the risk he was taking. But at this point, it was the only choice he had. The asset was almost theirs. They just had to hold on a little longer. The following week, everything changed. The lawyers had managed to unlock the hidden asset, and it was enough to give Thomas and Sarah the leverage they needed. But the victory was bittersweet. The investors were furious. They had underestimated Thomas, and now they were coming after him with everything they had. A meeting was set, and Thomas had to prepare for the confrontation of his life. "This is it," Sarah said, handing him the final documents. "They won't back down easily." Thomas nodded, a mixture of dread and determination on his face. "Neither will I." The day of the meeting arrived, and Thomas sat in the conference room, surrounded by the investors and their lawyers. The tension was palpable. Thomas could feel the weight of their gazes on him, but he wasn't going to back down. He had come too far, and now it was time to fight. As the meeting began, Thomas took a deep breath. This was his moment. He was either going to win, or he was going to lose everything. The meeting was a battlefield. Every word Thomas spoke was met with resistance, every move countered by the investors' lawyers. But Thomas didn't back down. He stood his ground, making his case with every ounce of strength he had left. Hours passed, and the room grew increasingly tense. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the investors spoke. "We'll give you what you want," he said coldly, "but you'll never fully control this company again." Thomas's heart raced. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had held his ground. As the meeting ended, and the investors filed out of the room, Thomas felt a sense of exhaustion wash over him. He had won, but the battle was far from over. The future of the company was uncertain, and Thomas knew that the consequences of his actions were far-reaching. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but for now, he had secured a small but vital victory. The days following the meeting with the investors were tense. The company had regained a sliver of control, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. Thomas spent sleepless nights staring at financial reports, trying to figure out his next move. Sarah had grown increasingly quiet, sensing that Thomas was shouldering the burden alone. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said one morning, her voice tinged with concern. He looked up from the papers strewn across his desk, his face pale from lack of sleep. "About what?" he asked. "About the future," she replied softly. "We can't keep going like this. You're pushing yourself too hard." Thomas rubbed his eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "The company's barely hanging on. If I don't keep fighting, we'll lose everything." Sarah stepped closer. "But at what cost, Thomas? You can't keep sacrificing yourself like this." Thomas looked at her, his expression filled with both frustration and fear. "I don't have a choice," he repeated, his voice cracking. "If I stop now, everything I've worked for is gone." The following week, Thomas received an unexpected visit. It was from Richard Colson, the man who had once been his mentor, but whose fall from grace had made him a ghost of his former self. Richard's presence in the office felt like a reminder of everything Thomas had lost. "You've got to stop," Richard said, his voice low and rough. Thomas looked up, surprised by the visit. "Stop what?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Stop pushing yourself so hard. You're walking a fine line, Thomas. I can see it. You're sacrificing your soul for this company, and it's going to destroy you." Thomas clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. "You don't get it," he spat. "This is my last shot. If I fail, I lose everything. My family, my future, everything." Richard sighed and leaned back in the chair. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said softly, "but there's nothing left for you to prove. Sometimes, the best way to win is to walk away." Thomas stared at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "I can't walk away, Richard. I can't." Richard's words echoed in Thomas's mind for days. The weight of what he had said hung over him, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was wrong. This was his fight, his future, and yet as the days passed, Thomas began to notice something strange. Henry's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The cold, calculating business partner that Thomas had always known was now acting out of character. During a routine meeting, Henry slammed his hand on the table, his face flushed with anger. "You're losing us everything," he shouted at Thomas. "We need to make bigger moves. We need more money, more control." Thomas stared at him in shock. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "You don't understand," Henry snapped. "You've been too focused on saving what little we have. We need to risk it all, or we're done." Thomas felt a surge of panic. Could Henry be right? Was he too focused on playing it safe? Or was this the beginning of Henry's true plan? To take everything for himself. Thomas spent the night alone in his office, replaying the meeting with Henry over and over in his mind. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off, that Henry was hiding something. The next morning, Thomas decided to confront him. He called Henry, his voice steady. "We need to talk," Thomas said. "Meet me at the office." When Henry arrived, Thomas wasted no time. "What are you really after, Henry?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Henry's eyes flickered with something dark. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. "You've been acting strange. You're pushing for riskier deals, for control," Thomas said. His eyes locked on Henry's. "What's your game?" Henry leaned forward, his face tense. "I'm trying to save us, Thomas. I'm trying to keep this company alive. You're the one who's been playing it safe." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Was Henry really just desperate? Or was this all part of a bigger plan to take control? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he couldn't back down now. "We're done, Henry," he said coldly. "You've crossed the line." With Henry out of the picture, Thomas felt both a sense of relief and dread. The company was now in his hands, but the pressure was even greater. The investors were still demanding their pound of flesh, and the financial situation was more precarious than ever. Sarah, who had been by his side through it all, sat across from him, her face concerned. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Henry's gone, but the fight's not over." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his face weary. "I'm sure. I've fought too hard to let it slip away now. This is my company, and I'm not giving it up." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Then we fight together. But we need to make one last push." Thomas looked at her, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'm ready." They had one final chance to turn things around, and Thomas knew it would take everything he had to pull it off. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas's relentless pursuit of control seemed to be wearing him thin. The financial pressure, the sleepless nights, the constant barrage of emails and phone calls, it was all taking a toll on him. He hadn't had a peaceful moment in weeks. Sarah had been pushing him to take a step back, to rest, but he couldn't afford to. He was walking a fine line, constantly on edge, always anticipating the next crisis. One night, as he sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his computer, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the investors. He clicked it open, his heart sinking as he read through the terms. The offer was clear. They wanted to take control of the company, and if Thomas didn't agree, they would push forward with their buyout plan. It was a make or break moment. His body tensed, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "I've got one last shot." He knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure if he could do it alone. The pressure was too much. The following morning, Thomas stood by the window, gazing out at the city. The weight of the decision he had to make pressed heavily on him. He couldn't just hand over control to the investors, not after everything he had worked for. As he stared out at the city below, Sarah entered the room. "You've seen the offer, haven't you?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving the skyline. "It's the end of the line, Sarah," he said softly. "If I don't accept it, I lose everything." Sarah stepped closer, her voice firm but compassionate. "You're not alone in this, Thomas. We've been through worse." He turned to her, his face filled with doubt. "What if it's too late? What if there's no way out?" Sarah's expression softened. "You're stronger than you think. We've come this far, and we're not backing down now." Thomas looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had one last chance to take control. He wasn't ready to let go yet. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We fight." That afternoon, Thomas met with his team. The decision had been made. They were going to fight the investors head-on. He called a meeting in the conference room, the weight of what was about to happen hanging over them all. As the team gathered around the table, Thomas stood at the head, his face hard with resolve. "This is it," he began. "We've been playing defense for too long. It's time to take the fight to them." He could see the skepticism in their eyes. They had been through so much already, and the pressure was taking its toll. "We're not backing down," Thomas continued, his voice steady. "We have the assets. We have the leverage. We just need to act fast." One of his team members, David, spoke up. "And if they don't back off," Thomas took a deep breath, "then we'll take it to the next level." The team exchanged uncertain glances, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they had no choice. They had to win this battle, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and endless strategy sessions. The team worked around the clock, preparing their counteroffer and mapping out their next move. But as the pressure mounted, Thomas began to crack. One night after another grueling session, he found himself alone in the office. The quiet was overwhelming. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion, the strain of everything he had sacrificed. "Is this worth it?" he whispered to himself. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "We're ready," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "We have the proposal. It's time to take it to the investors." Thomas's heart raced as he stood up, the weight of the moment hitting him like a wave. This was it. There was no turning back now. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady but filled with tension. It was time for the final confrontation. The day of the meeting with the investors had arrived. Thomas stood in the conference room, waiting for the others to arrive. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. When the investors entered, the room fell into an uneasy silence. They took their seats, their expressions hard, their eyes cold. "You've had your chance," one of the investors said, "but now it's time to hand over control." Thomas stood tall, his voice unwavering. "Not yet," he replied. "We have a new proposal. And this time you'll listen." He slid the documents across the table, his heart racing as the investors began to look over the proposal. "You've been trying to push us out for too long," Thomas continued, his tone calm but firm. "But we're not going down without a fight." The silence stretched on as the investors read the proposal, their faces unreadable. Finally, one of them spoke. "We'll consider it," he said, "but know this. If you're playing games, you'll lose everything." Thomas' eyes never left him. "Then let's play." Thomas felt relief after the investor meeting, but it was fleeting. The company had been saved, but at great cost. Sarah asked, "What now?" Thomas replied, "We move forward, but everything has changed." The battle was won, but the emotional toll remained. Thomas read Richard's message, feeling empty despite his success. Is this worth it? He wondered. The victory had cost him more than money. It had cost his peace of mind. He couldn't continue on this path. Thomas stepped down from his CEO position. What now? Sarah asked. I need to take a step back, Thomas replied. Sarah supported his decision. It was time to let go. In a park, Thomas realized he needed to let go and find peace. Maybe this is what I needed all along, he thought, the weight of his decisions lifting. In a cafe, Thomas and Sarah talked about their future. We've made it through, Thomas said. Sarah smiled. You've earned it. For the first time, Thomas felt at peace.